Hello and a very warm welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching The Big Picture with me, Frank Razan Pereira. The DNA Technology Regulation Bill, which seeks to control the use of DNA technology for establishing the identity of a person, was introduced in the Lok Sabha on Monday amid questions being raised by opposition parties on its provisions. A similar bill was passed in the Lok Sabha in January, but it could not be cleared in the Rajya Sabha. The bill had then lapsed with the dissolution of the previous Lok Sabha. The proposed law, which has been in the making since at least 2003, is the third attempt by the government to enact a law to regulate the use of DNA technology in the country after an earlier version of the bill had been finalized in 2015 but could not be introduced in Parliament. The Congress was against the introduction of the bill, raising privacy and other concerns. The Minister for Science and Technology, Dr. Harshvardhan, who introduced the bill, however, rejected the concerns raised by the opposition, saying there is no serious substance. On this edition of The Big Picture, we will take a closer look at the DNA Technology Use and Application Regulation Bill of 2019. Joining me on the program today are Professor S.E. Hasnain, Vice-Chancellor, Jamia Hamdard; Chakshu Roy, Head of Outreach, PRS Legislative Research; Dr. Vikram Singh, former DGP, Uttar Pradesh; and Desh Ratan Nigam, Advocate of the Supreme Court. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of The Big Picture. Chakshu, I'd like to begin the program with you. Let's first understand the salient features of this bill.
Frank, the bill is trying to establish a regulatory framework for usage of DNA information. So it is doing two or three things. One, it is establishing authorities at the center and the state level for keeping the DNA information. And then the bill provides as to what kinds of DNA information will be kept. So it says that there are indexes, there will be 5 indexes. There is an index of under trials, there's an index for suspects, there is an index for missing persons, and 2 more of these indexes. The second thing it does is it establishes a regulatory board. And now the purpose of the regulatory board would be that the regulatory board, amongst many other things, will also authorize laboratories across the country who would be allowed to collect DNA information. So that's the second thing that's doing. The third thing that it's doing is it's providing a framework for collection of DNA information and also removal of DNA information, right? And finally, it is doing that in the context of 2 or 3 types of, how will this DNA information be used? So it provides a schedule at the end of the act, and the schedule then lists down circumstances or the provisions of law under which the DNA information collected will be used. So that's broadly, the 4 or 5 things that it's doing. You mentioned that the bill has been in progress for some time. I just would like to add one more thing. The Law Commission also, looked at the usage of DNA information, and they came out with a report, and they also recommended a draft bill in 2017. This bill, first came to the Lok Sabha. It was passed by Lok Sabha. Lok Sabha dissolved, the 16th Lok Sabha dissolved, so the bill could not, carry forward its journey in Parliament. And now, the minister has introduced it again. So that's where we stand at currently with respect to the bill.
Professor Hasnain, I'd like your views on this particular bill because you so closely worked with it. What is the history of this particular bill, and why was there a need to bring about a bill?
Thank you so much for inviting me to this forum today. It's something very close to me because this bill was the work of an institution that I was associated with from the start, the Center for DNA Fingerprinting and Diagnostics, based in Hyderabad. And it was about 2000 where we decided to hold an international congress on how biology is impacting society. And the focus then was how biology, and biology means the way we are, what we have in our genes. And that is where this meeting was organized by the then President of India, Dr. APJ Abdul Kalam, and it had a large number of legal minds, including the Chief Justices of many high courts, the Supreme Court judges, many people from India and abroad, including the person who filed the first patent application to patent living form, Ananda Chakrabarti, in the US. Now, based on this meeting, 5-day meeting, a recommendation was made that DNA has already found at that time application in crime resolution across many countries of the world. But India has not been in the forefront at all, and that is where the need was felt that we should create a bill. And that is where myself and the then Vice Chancellor of Hyderabad Law School, Nalsar, we sat together, and it took us almost 2 years to finally draft the first bill. And I think the first bill we presented to the Ministry of Science and Technology, my Department of Biotechnology, back in 2002. And then it has gone through several iterations and revisions. We had a final meeting somewhere around 2006 or 7 with the then Home Minister, and we were assured that the bill will finally be placed. Now, why is this bill important? This bill is important because now that in the country, DNA has been admitted as an evidence. It was not initially considered as an evidence at all till CDFD, my institution, urged and worked for it. Having been used now as an evidence, crime where you have difficulty in solving cases where a Volvo becomes a truck, cases where witnesses disappear or witnesses they backtrack and they are made hostile, those cases are completely over because DNA does not lie. The trick is you must learn how to collect the DNA, how to carry out the fingerprinting. Initially it was done only at my institution, the Center for DNA Fingerprinting and Diagnostics. Subsequently, we trained many CFSL labs. We also empowered the CVI lab in UP, I believe it's one in Ghaziabad. And now all across the country we have DNA labs. And today DNA has become a very popular tool to get the truth. Truth because DNA can be collected from crime scene, can be collected from dead bodies, can be collected from any body parts, body fluid, even a flock of, even a hair, or even from the saliva that you use to seal simple things like an envelope. So that is where it's become very powerful, and wherever DNA has been used, conviction rate is assured. Conviction is very high.
Okay.
Which in our country, for whatever reason, it's very poor. So I think DNA is very relevant. I must must compliment this government for finally having taken the initiative to bring this in the shape of a law, convert the bill into a law. It could have become last parliament itself, but somehow it could not do so.
Sure, certainly. So I'm going to take the points that you're making forward with Dr. Singh. Dr. Singh, how will the bill help the investigating agencies and the criminal justice system as a whole?
Frank, let me compliment the government for bringing out this bill and carrying Professor Hasnain's points forward. I would say that this is going to be the game changer as a futuristic technology. It is going to bring about a revolution in criminology and criminal investigation. As Professor Hasnain has said, that there are 5 indices: the scene of crime, the accused, the victim, as also apart from that, the missing persons, the unidentified dead bodies. These happen to be the Waterloo of very many police chiefs because these cases go by default and remain unsolved for decades together. Now with the DNA technology and their admissibility in a court of law, this is going to be an infallible tool in the hands of investigators and the police forces in the country, and at par with the best in the world anywhere. Now, apart from the fact, we have added also the civil component into it, the paternity issues, the progeny issues, as also IVF fertilizations, and other several issues which I would not like to go into because they're far too sensitive. But yes, we have also taken the provisions of storage, deletion, and other things like the regulatory bodies both at the center and at the regional level. It is a misnomer to say that the DNA storage facilities require something like very, very expensive inputs and investment. No. Basic laboratories can be upgraded and can be used. And indeed, the capacity building exercise, once I think it will take about 12 months before investigators are told, then it's going to be the game changer. Frank, let us make no mistake about it. We should not live in an illusion. We are victims of terrorism. We are victims of anti-national elements. And they take pains to obliterate the science and the identity of the victims also, and they change their own identities. Fugitives of justice, they run away and change their identities. This is indeed going to be the game changer in times to come, and I feel very excited because this tool is going to give a weapon that will be infallible in times to come.
Okay, all right. It's going to be a game changer, is what Dr. Vikram Singh is suggesting. Tej Ratan Nigam, I'd like to bring you to the picture now. So, will the bill help the judicial system and strengthen the judicial system, or will it clog it further?
Well, let me tell you, most of the time we have seen as a lawyer that people get acquitted because of lack of evidence, conclusive evidence. DNA over the period of time through its research has been established that it is irrefutable, infallible and concrete evidence, and nobody can change it. Once it is there, when DNA sampling has been done and DNA fingerprinting has been done, it becomes conclusive. Only an expert, DNA expert from the lab has to go and testify that this is the sample and this is the conclusion and the results. Once it goes to the court, then I think your conviction rate is going to improve a lot. And that is where it is strengthening and supporting the justice delivery system, especially the criminal justice delivery system. And well, people have raised issues of safeguards, but I think this bill is the need of the hour. It has already been delayed a lot. See, look at the US or the European countries, they are using it for solving the crimes, and we are far behind, lagging behind. And this is the loophole that the criminals utilize and get away from our system. I think this is, instead of clogging, this will declog our system.
Okay. Chakshu, several attempts have been made by Modi 1.0 as well to try and pass this particular bill, but somehow it has not sailed through the Rajya Sabha. So, why is that so? What's the problem really?
No, Frank, I don't think there's a problem in passing the bill. I think the issue to be considered is this is a technical piece of legislation, and while I agree with my co-panelists that it has gone through several lines of consultations and there's a history behind it, for Parliament this is a fresh piece of legislation. So maybe what is required in Parliament is a process of deliberation and consultation. One of those mechanisms is a parliamentary standing committee. So perhaps if this bill goes to a parliamentary standing committee for a little bit of a detailed scrutiny, then the government will be able to convince political parties across the aisle and get them on board with respect to the bill. I was watching the debate when the introduction to the bill was happening in the Lok Sabha, and one of the objections that was raised with regards to the bill was that it covers the use of DNA information not only for criminal offences but also for civil offences. And some members objected to the usage for both criminal and civil, and they were like, why does it need to be used for civil offences? Probably civil offences could be kept out of the purview of that. And I think the concern that they were raising was that there is some kind of a consent requirement when you're collecting DNA profile information when it comes to criminal offences. But that in the earlier version of the bill, that consent requirement for using DNA information for civil cases was missing. I think another concern that some experts have pointed out is DNA information can not only establish identity, it can also tell us many things about an individual. So for example, the kind of medical ailments that could have. In other countries, the usage or only that part of the DNA is used which can be used for establishing identity, and the remaining part of the DNA is not used. So that's another issue that has bothered some experts, that in our law, is that delimitation of usage of DNA, only that part for establishing identity is going to be there, or will it be slightly more encompassing?
Okay, yes, Dr. Vikram Singh, I can see you raising your hand there. Please go ahead.
Frank, there was a concern about the fact that it can be used for self-incrimination. No, it cannot be used for self-incrimination. You may recall that there is a provision of consent. In all matters that the punishment is less than 7 years, a consent is required. Where the punishment is more than in serious offences, where it's more than 7 years, a consent is not required. Often you have the criminals volunteering to say, please take my samples because I'm being framed. There are occasions when they have a legitimate ground said that the police are framing them. They themselves volunteer for narco analysis, which also has a provision that unless he gives it in writing, the accused, that he can subject himself to narco analysis, he cannot be subjected to narco analysis. Likewise, in case of DNA profiling, if there is a voluntary acceptance of DNA profiling, so be it, because that will meet the ends of justice. And if indeed that person is being framed, that issue can be mitigated and resolved there itself.
Sure. Okay, Professor Hasnain, I can see that you also want to come in on the discussion. Definitely the floor is yours, but also a question that I have for you is, are there any concerns as far as this bill is concerned? Because you've seen it change over the years. How is it different and how has it progressed really from 2000 to 2019 now?
Right. Let me flag the issues that have been, let me address issues that have been flagged. See, the question of DNA bill and the DNA profile that we generate today, technically that's a completely neutral profile. While my colleague on the podium has rightly pointed out, DNA can not only give you a profile which makes you identical to what you are, which makes as an identification mark for you, but it can also be used for other things like your susceptibility to a disease, your sexual behavior, and many things. You know, your all kinds of things are now attributed to DNA. But the profile that's generated today, the targets that are being used to generate a profile, they are today neutral. Which means if you make a DNA profile and keep it, nobody can get any other information, anything other than purely using this as your signature, as your genetic signature. So let there be no ambiguity on that. The concern that I have are the following. Number one, we can collect the DNA from any biological or any other immediate, intimate or non-intimate materials. The question is, how do we collect and how do we know that after collection the material will not be destroyed? And that is a very important part, and that is where if the biological material is not destroyed, it can be taken over by an insurance agency, and let's say from high profile, high net worth individual, then my DNA for whatever reason has been required, then after collection, the investigating agency hands over my DNA, not the profile, the DNA, to an insurance agency or to some other agency, where they can now use this against me, saying that, look, you are likely to do this, or you are likely to come down, so I'll increase your health insurance because you are going to come down with HIV/AIDS or other disease. Now, how do we ensure that? One of the provision of the bill says, I believe chapter 4, where it talks about the DNA laboratory, it says the DNA material after taking the sample will be passed on back to the investigator, to the investigating officer. I think that will create a suspicion whether he will destroy it, or if he'll destroy it, will it really be destroyed or not? So why can't it simply be the assurance of the laboratory that whatever is not required or whatever has been used up will be destroyed by the laboratory? I think this is first concern. Second concern is about the DNA storage bill. We have 5-6 metrics on which indices on which we are going to create the profile. There is a provision in the current bill which I think maybe the Rajya Sabha may like to discuss. I don't think it needs to go to a parliamentary committee, in my opinion. That's only delayed. We must now, we have waited for about 2 decades now, we must now call it a day and pass the bill after addressing these concerns. The concern I'm talking about is about storing the DNA. It says DNA profile can be erased, can be removed if the person who has given the profile can give it in writing. Now, I think that is not going to be helpful for the simple reason, when the tsunami came in India about few years ago in southern parts of the country, it was my team that went all the way to Chennai and the affected areas and picked up the bodies which were unclaimed, stinking parts, etc., and then reconstructed who the individual was, and then it was delivered to the concerned person. Imagine if the concerned person's fingerprint had been removed from the database, these bodies would not have been assigned to a particular relative, and they would not have been given a decent burial or a decent funeral. And that is where I don't think we should destroy the database. The profiles are absolutely neutral.
Right.
There is, in my opinion, there is no need to destroy the database. Database should be locked in and kept it. Just like perhaps you don't destroy the database of it should not be destroyed. So these are some of the concerns which can be addressed while it is being debated in the Rajya Sabha.
Okay, absolutely. All right. There are some concerns that need to be debated, but the bill is the need of the hour and it should pass as soon as possible is what Professor Hasnain is suggesting. Deshratan Nigam, so there are talking about concerns. There are certain sections of the society which have raised privacy concerns as well as far as this bill is concerned. Are they justified?
Recently Supreme Court also passed a judgment that right to privacy is integral part of a fundamental right to life. So there are concerns, there are no doubt about it. But how do you balance the two? The resolution of the crime and on the other hand the right to privacy. The only issue, as rightly pointed out by Mr. Hasnain, was that it has to be protected. The data protection has to be complete, and there is a law also coming up and the government is in the process of making that law about data protection, and that I think should come first and then this bill should be passed. Or both the elements can be integrated in one law, and that is what is required. Data protection is absolutely necessary. Even if somebody wants to challenge it in the Supreme Court, I don't think will strike down this law, but will address the concerns about data protection. And that is where the law which is coming up is very, very important. And also, when you don't need this law, say for example, in place like UK, after 30-40 years, it is not required, it is destroyed. And there are other countries where, if you're not even charge sheeted or you are acquitted, it is destroyed. Those are the aspects have to be brought into this bill. And I think a lot of concerns have been addressed in this bill. But I think data protection is a very important, DNA data protection is very important and should be looked into.
Okay, that's a very important point that you've raised. I'd like to take that point to Professor Hasnain. Closing comments from all my guests. Professor Hasnain, the point that is raised by the advocate on the panel, do you believe that we need a data protection law first and then probably go ahead with this DNA bill, or take them simultaneously maybe?
To be honest, I don't think the kind of issues that you are worrying about data protection, these are completely benign data. However, if you have the biological sample available for doing much more analysis, those need to be protected. Those cannot be allowed. But the DNA profile data only establishes an identity. It's just like barcode. Barcodes cannot tell you about anything other than saying that these barcodes represent who you are. That's it. So there are issues. But as long as you are sure that the data would be completely protected, number one. And number two, the biological samples will not be used for any further analysis. This is the most critical part. If it can be used, it will be more deadly than the issues that come up with Aadhaar. So that is where one needs to worry about.
Okay, all right. Chakshu, so a couple of technical aspects now. So who will be allowed to collect this info, and how will this info be used? Does the bill address all of these issues as well?
Frank, the bill addresses many of these issues. But I think, as part of my closing comments, one of the things that I'd like to underscore is this is a technical piece of legislation. Dr. Hasnain, Dr. Singh are experts in these areas. So when Parliament is deliberating on these issues, Parliament also needs to hear the opinions of these experts, right? Parliament will be debating it on the floor of the House. The floor of the House does not offer you too much opportunity to go into the details. If Dr. Hasnain, for example, had an opportunity to come to Parliament and explain to the Parliamentary Committee as to what was the need and what was the advantage, he would be able to allay the fears of the parliamentarian. So when the parliamentarians go and debate that bill on the floor of the House, they would be that much better informed. So my only reason for saying that this is something that should be referred to a committee is this is a technical piece of legislation. Not only the text of the law, the operating regulations will be as important in the implementation of the law as the text of the law. So that's, and whenever Parliament deliberates on technical issues, especially scientific technical issues where technology changes quickly and has a large scale impact, those needs to be considered carefully before a Parliament goes ahead and legislates on them.
Sure. Dr. Singh, I'd like to draw your attention to another aspect. There are several cases and several news reports and several things that we've heard of in the past where the crime scene itself is contaminated. How do we ensure that that does not happen? Do we have the trained staff and the technology to deal and to collect DNA in the first place?
Wonderful question, Mr. Frank. I would say the comprehensive roadmap for capacity building. Because if we do not have that, you may recall that earlier laws on electronic surveillance and inputs by the Supreme Court in Amar Singh's case, it said that the CDR, the call detail reports, your and mine, could be compromised. And that you really had to have a circular from the MHA to ensure that call details are not compromised. Like any law, this law will have to stand the test of time. And if there is any roadblock, I'm sure the circulars and other regulations would ensure and streamline this act and ensure capacity building, number one, training of police officers and investigators, and also the checks and balances that it is not misused, as Professor Hasnain has mentioned. There are certain things, it's a new statute, but a wonderful statute. And the reservations, I feel, are being raised for the sake of being raised. There is no depth or substance in the question marks that are being raised that this will compromise the personal privacy concerns.
Okay, all right. And Desh Ratan Nigam, what's the best way forward?
See, let us be very clear, we are already very late on this aspect, and the law, it should be passed as soon as possible, first. And secondly, every law when passed has its own evolution, and you see the best of the laws face certain roadblocks and certain new situations come up, and that can be taken care of through amendments or through various circulars, as pointed out by our co-panelists. So I don't think there is a reason to delay the law. We are already delayed, and it's high time. I think all the parliamentarians should come together and apply their mind, discuss it thoroughly, and pass this law, and evolution will take its due course to improve it.
Absolutely. And Professor Hasnain, close the show for us with your concluding remark.
Absolutely. This is the game changer. Let's go ahead and do this. Allay the fears and go ahead and do it in this session itself.
Okay, all right. With that, then we'll call it a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. With that, it's a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. See you again next time.